It's with the most delight that I'm here to present our distinguished keynote lecturer, Deborah Thomas, and also welcome you all. I'm sorry I cannot say welcome to you in Lisbon. Marta has some images that I just sent her because I'm so techno deficient that I was afraid I could not pass them. It was supposed to have an image of Lisbon now. Well, anyway, I wish I could say welcome to Lisbon. This is something I've been repeating on and on again for the last few months. I hope we can do it in the near future. I wish so much that you could be with us, Deborah, and all of you being interacting. And I've been saying this with a mixed feeling of loss and also of awe for being witness of and participant in discussion kind of apocalypse of the world of academic communication as we knew it. Before I hand the floor to Deborah Thomas, who will share with us her inspiring analysis on the future of us all, to use her own wording. Just a note of thanks to the team that put together this conference, the trio Marta Macedo, Colette and Irene Peano. Could you put the next slides, please, Marta? Team members of the project, The Color of Labor, The Racialized Lives of Migrants. I am overly proud that they took the initiative of everything related to this conference and pulled the cards need to bring you all together for these timely debates. Believe me, it was supposed to be different, but that's what we have now. And I wish you a fantastic discussion. I'm happy to see it growing in the context of the project I have the chance to run with funds from the European Research Council. Could you please, Marta, put the next slide? Which I thank the ERC for trusting me into engaging and getting in an engaged team into the analysis of the dynamic processes of race making in the plantation and plantation-like economies across empires. I also thank our host, the Institute of Social Sciences in the University of Lisbon, and I invite you all to check the website, The Color of Labor, and see our theoretical goals, our research in progress in different contexts, and our analytical outcomes. I hope many of you may remain in touch and that we keep these matters high up in the wider research agenda and public discussions. And now time to hand the floor for Deborah Thomas, whose profile is so rich. Can you put the next slide, please? That I cannot make justice to it. She's a Jean Brownlee Professor of Anthropology at University of Pennsylvania, Director of the Center of Experimental Ethnography, the former Editor-in-Chief of American Anthropologist, a most inspiring filmmaker, an author that cut new horizons in contemporary theory, and in the makings of ethnography, a dancer, an artist, a polymath for the modern times, and the best possible speaker for this conference. We can move the image now, Marta. May I only highlight your last book, Political Life in the Wake of the Plantation, Sovereignty, Witnessing and Repair, published in 2019 by Duke. Deborah, thank you so much for coming. I'm delighted to have you here. And now the floor is yours. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Cristiana, Marta, Irene, and Colette. Muito obrigado. Sorry, my Portuguese is rusty. Há muito anos que eu morava em Salvador. Thank you for persevering to do this virtually. I know it's not what was planned, and of course we would all prefer to be together in Lisbon, but I know we also all appreciate you creating this environment where we can still talk across vast differences in time zone and location. And I'm looking forward to listening in on some of the discussions and to sharing with you today. And I hope that these discussions form the basis of a time when we can be together eventually in the same place. I want to start by saying that I've been particularly hailed by your call to think about plantations as both material and symbolic aesthetic landscapes, as spaces of imagination, to think also transnationally about their lives and their afterlives in both geopolitical and intimate registers. As you know, my own obsession over the years has had to do with the Caribbean and with the processes of coloniality in the Western Hemisphere. When Spain, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and France set sail to the so-called New World, they inaugurated an epochal shift that generated new systems of economic production and consumption, new forms of social hierarchy, and new kinds of political relationship. These transformations led to the rise of the modern West, and through continued imperialism and slavery, the global dominance of Western civilization. The specter of the plantation looms large in this dominance as a space of order and violence, of cruelty and debauchery, of power, and of the striving for something different. So like many of you, I've been grappling in different kinds of ways with the following questions. If the modern West was built on indigenous dispossession and slavery through the development of plantation-based agriculture, and if both indigenous and African-descended populations were excluded from modern personhood, then what could it possibly mean to be human politically in the wake of the West? How have people confronted the unpredictable afterlives of colonialism and slavery, nationalism and state formation in ways that perform not only a material transformation, but also an affective one? What does sovereignty feel like? These questions have been haunting me over the past many years as I've been developing archives of the relationships between sovereignty and violence in Jamaica. My specific obsessions have had to do with the temporal regimes to which post-colonial sovereignty projects have been tethered, how these have conditioned the affective states through which they're enacted and experienced, and how they have shaped the complex relationships among sovereignty and subjectivity within a context whose foundational infrastructures were imperialism, colonization, and plantation-based slavery. I've been interested in what Sylvia Wynter identified as a constitutive tension between the dominant logic of the plantation and its internal threat, the often millennial spaces within which enslaved persons maintained a conception of themselves as human rather than as property. It's this tension that would ultimately shape the relationship between the national and the popular in struggles over sovereignty. And it's this tension that becomes legible by attending both to moments of exceptional violence and to the realm of everyday practice. My mode of attention to these tensions has been a form of bearing witness that I've been calling Witnessing 2.0. This is not the witnessing of human rights organizations or of public tribunals like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Witnessing 2.0 is instead a quotidian practice of watching, listening, and feeling that is relational and profoundly intersubjective. It's a moral practice that involves exploring our complicity within contemporary events, what Avery Gordon has elaborated as responsibility. Witnessing 2.0 thus makes visible how affects operate in multiple temporalities and across levels of consciousness. It's a practice of recognition and of love that destabilizes the boundaries between knowing and feeling, complicity and accountability, and it's one that potentially reformulates the ground of the human itself. By focusing on the extent to which one recognizes the various ways we're implicated in the processes we address, Witnessing 2.0 produces intimacies through the development of affective archives, while it also reveals the ways we maintain the conjunctures of power within which we live. And for me, It provides a way to take seriously embodied ways of knowing and understanding in an effort to track the long-term entanglements that have produced and sustained the binaries structuring the modern world, in order to find ways to undo dualistic modalities of thinking and acting so that we can generate meaningful forms of repair. Witnessing 2.0, I feel, can ultimately produce the internal shifts in consciousness that radiate from one to another in unexpected and necessarily non-linear ways, and that lead to lasting and world-changing transformations. And for me, this is the imperative, right? We must cultivate archives through attentive embodied care in order to recognize and respond to the psychic and socio-political dynamics in which we're complicit, and therefore generate the ability to be responsible to ourselves and to others. Has a project that explores in a range of forms the 2010 state of emergency in West Kingston, Jamaica. In May of that year, security forces went into the neighborhood of Tivoli Gardens in order to capture Christopher Dudus Koch, who had been ordered for extradition to the United States. Officially, 74 civilians were killed during the operation, but the number community members give is closer to 200. Beginning in 2012, I worked collaboratively with Junior Wedderburn and Deanne Bell on a multimodal project addressing these events. We assembled archives, including drone footage, archival footage, still in moving images of the contemporary landscape, still in video portraiture, and narratives. And we were interested in how these assemblages could bring into being a range of affective orientations, themselves differently apprehended based on one's location, politically, structurally, nationally, and psychically. Ultimately, we were interested in the forms of recognition that might be possible across these various locations, and in the extent to which visual archives might either generate them and make them available, or on the other hand, make them unrealizable. The project also represents our attempt to bring into being a different ethical register, one that focuses on the quotidian expectations and experiences of social and political personhood within the neighborhood of Tivoli Gardens, and one that also creates a different kind of archive than that which is more generally publicly available. And to explain what I mean by this, you have to know that Tivoli Gardens has always been what one resident calls the flagship community for the Jamaica Labour Party, the mother of all so-called garrison communities. Now, garrison communities in Jamaica are territorially rooted, homogeneous voting neighborhoods in downtown Kingston, where political support has been exchanged for contracts and other social welfare benefits. And these exchanges are mediated through the relationship between a politician, a legitimately elected politician, and a local leader who we call dons. While the partisanship of garrison communities has been enduring, the relationship between elected politicians and community leaders became part of a more general ideological struggle during the 1970s between socialism and capitalism, and transformed again as the elaboration of the transnational trades in cocaine and weapons supplanted a previously smaller scale trafficking in ganja. The latter phenomenon strengthened the role of the dons vis-a-vis the politicians, as dons' increasing involvement in both illicit and legitimate businesses provided politicians with financial support, in addition to the militia-like support that was offered during election periods. Garrisons, therefore, exist as a primary loci of political corruption, historically and in the present. And they also constitute a kind of palimpsest of the plantation. If we understand the political dynamics of the plantation during the period of slavery as having inaugurated a system of and clientelism, albeit an unstable one, in which political authority was not only racialized, but also tied to territorially rooted patterns of protection that ultimately encouraged alliances between the powerful and those they exploited, and that undermined alliances among the exploited themselves, then we see continuities with systems of political patronage and clientelism that have come to characterize partisan politics during the post-colonial period in Jamaica. What I'm trying to highlight is that just as the plantation was foundational to modern economic production and labor organization, it was also the plantation that shaped the infrastructures, practices, and processes of politics during the post-emancipation period and within post-colonial New World nation states. So this becomes important in relation to normative visual representations of garrison communities, because these are representations that have tended to foreground the sensationalist dimensions of poverty and political violence. And it's important in two ways. So first, this kind of ghetto porn, what I call ghetto porn, allows viewers to imagine that the violence that happens in these communities is episodic and that it's culturally derived rather than being the result of structural and institutionalized political decisions taken over time. And the second effect of visualizing Tivoli Gardens in a flattened way is that most Kingstonians, and Jamaicans more generally, who do not live in downtown garrisons have a difficult time imagining people who do as being fully human and therefore possessing either individual or collective rights or the ability to imagine a different future. And a phrase that we commonly heard in the process of telling friends in Jamaica about what we were doing, even those who had a long history of political progressivism, was that there are no innocents in Tivoli, meaning that Tivoli Gardens denizens were always already saturated by criminality. For those articulating this sentiment, the actions of the security forces during the May 2010 incursion were ultimately legitimate, if also examples of extrajudicial violence. And for them, the other archives produced by the state during and in the wake of the incursion, and these archives include the de facto census of the youth who eventually ended up at the National Stadium, photographed, fingerprinted, named, and attached to a physical address. The so-called Book of the Dead, which was the online photo album of unidentified bodies in various states of decomposition that were perused at the police station by family members hoping to locate lost loved ones. These kinds of archives were necessary, both in terms of securing a previously unruly landscape and making it legible to the institutions of the state, and in relation to the need to identify and bring some kind of closure to the mass of civilians directly affected by the joint police-military action. As a response to these hegemonic forms of visuality and legibility, we took our interviewees out of the community and into a recording studio where photographer Varun Baker shot still portraits of them before we filmed their narratives. We also filmed against a stark white background in order to encourage viewers to focus on people's words and their faces, to attempt to generate a kind of intimacy, acknowledgement, and recognition, and to open a space for a more profound, if fleeting, intersubjectivity. Our intention was not, in other words, to generate trauma testimonies, but was instead to develop a dynamic affective space in which the trauma of exceptional violence was deeply contextualized at multiple levels of scale, and in which the entanglements among these different levels of scale remained as open and unresolved questions rather than as pat narratives. This intention also permeated the sound Junior Wedderburn created for the documentary, for the nonlinear short that I'm going to show you in a moment, and for the exhibit that was installed at the Penn Museum in 2017. The sound was designed to move between a sense of enclosure and trepidation and one of potentiality. It was to lead viewers through the events without necessarily satisfying a desire for or expectation of affective resolution, and to support the narratives without romanticizing them. I'm going to show you that now.
During my small time comments, I don't know much.
I went to school, garden high school.
Don't they with the children already in the ballet for going to because my little girl in session now while if I live with her you know, me not really know about them always when them come and say like them have some you know really state yourself most to go up with the building and place. I don't know why they never normally come around with this. You tell about a movement and you do this.
I had a CD stand and a CD shop
For all of it.
in 12 guards.
I don't know why they never normally come around with this.
Right,
Never have a problem
inside
with
12
it.
guards, a place called Bastos.
Mike, you can walk and come there. Back to Mike, you can come back. Walk and forward. They wait for you.
So I was going up, I live at the first, I was going up and because I didn't, this night I was just
this favorite still football and
So Tivoli Stories is in many ways a visual representation of the afterlives of the plantation, of a modern political organization created in, through, and against coloniality. It's a representation of our contemporary condition that speaks within the current discourse of crisis, the collapse of liberal democracy, the evisceration of a civil public sphere, and of the notion of rights, and the erosion of the very health of the planet and any certainty regarding our environmental futures. But I've also been wondering over the past several years about what it would mean to frame an understanding of our contemporary condition in the language of epochal shift rather than crisis. If we know that imperialism and slavery have many afterlives, what would it mean to assert that the moment constitutes another epochal shift, now the death of Western modernity? The current global reconfiguration of economic, political, and cultural power has been occasioned in part by the resurgence of China on the global stage, but also by new spatial and temporal organizations of policing and control, and by new modalities of knowledge production that in turn produce new audiences and mandate new forms of accountability. If we are indeed witnessing the emergence of a new geopolitical condition, then we must also develop new models of sovereignty and conventions of inquiry. So for me, the language of epochal shift helps us respond to the challenges posed by the contemporary condition in a way that exemplifies a decolonial vision for knowledge production substantially informed by transnational Black and queer feminist critique. On one hand, it gives us terms like the Anthropocene, and on another, it adds dimension to the work of scholars of post-coloniality or post-modernity, who for so long have rejected the notion that the post-colonial present marks a significant departure from European imperialism. Thinking through the frame of epochal shift also requires that we reconfigure the forms of intimacy and notions of scale that have been normative within some of our disciplines. How do we capture the everydayness of epochal shifts? What forms of evidence can we mobilize to perceive shifts that aren't always understood as world-changing while they're happening, when they sneak up on us, or when they appear suddenly in our faces? And if we know that the Caribbean was the epicenter of the epochal shift we call modernity, and that the region facilitated of the dominance of the West, what would it mean to contend that the death of the West is also perhaps most visible from the space of the Caribbean? What can the region teach us about global processes most generally? And how might we mine the space of the plantation for ways to think about self-determination outside the boundaries of Western liberal infrastructures of sovereignty, and instead envision social change outside the boundaries of revolution? I mentioned earlier that the expanding global role of China is one sphere in which we might root the death of the West. Like all countries, China is today facing the challenges of global neoliberalism, and in its move away from a planned economy has shed upward of 450 million workers, contributing to its outbound push. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, a development strategy organized around infrastructural investments and resource extraction across over 150 countries, the Chinese government has sought to generate new trading patterns with China at the center. A 21st century Silk Road that encompasses both land and sea routes, returning us to older patterns of imperialism grounded in trade rather than territory, or as Philip Hayward has put it, aquapelagos instead of archipelagos. As a result of the Belt and Road Initiative, China has become the third largest source of foreign direct investment in the world, having developed a massive presence in Africa and throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. Contemporary Chinese investment in and migration to the African continent builds on older movements, beginning with South Africa, where Chinese laborers appeared in the mid-17th century. China's contemporary presence in Africa also builds on significant economic and political solidarities that were generated between China and some Latin American, Caribbean, and African countries during the Cold War through the non-aligned movement of the 1970s. These solidarities were also engendered by the Chinese government's position of non-intervention, which set them apart from Soviet and European communists, as well as Western capitalist states who were attempting to cultivate satellite states. This policy was based on PRC principles formulated in the 1940s that emphasized, quote, mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference in others' internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. Their contemporary presence in Africa, however, is significantly more complex. Chinese governmental and corporate activity in Africa has also differed in many ways from that in Latin America and the Caribbean, where China's President Xi Jinping set an investment goal of $500 billion in trade between 2015 and 2019, and simultaneously encouraged the migration of Chinese entrepreneurs to establish businesses, special economic zones, and industrial parks. In Latin America, investment has been focused particularly on trade in natural resources and commodity exchange. And in the Caribbean, it has been geared toward development assistance through infrastructure, especially in the smaller islands, with some interest also in tourism, forestry, construction, infrastructure development, real estate, ports, and bauxite. The Caribbean, as Richard Bernal has argued, has a, quote, geographical advantage, given its close proximity to the United States, the largest market in the world, end quote. Nevertheless, the Caribbean has a trade deficit with China, while Latin American countries have sustained a surplus, though one that tends toward primary exports. And of course, the competition with Taiwan for diplomatic recognition and the pressure to support the One China policy has been a significant factor in China's engagement with Caribbean governments. As was the case with many African countries, there has also been a long-standing history of Chinese presence throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, dating from the early 19th century. And this is the result of both indentured and free migration and of 19th century industrialization. Ultimately, Jamaica became second only to Cuba in terms of numbers of Chinese migrants. Once in Jamaica, most Chinese left the plantations before their contracts expired, and by the turn of the 20th century, 61% of the Chinese population was centered in Kingston. As in other British West Indian territories, many Chinese went into shopkeeping and came to dominate the retail trade. But unlike those in Trinidad and Guyana, Chinese in Jamaica did not face significant competition from other groups like Lebanese and Portuguese, and they became known and appreciated for a number of innovative business practices like stocking smaller portions of food staples such as saltfish, cornmeal, flour, and rice, offering lower prices, and extending credit. Despite their centrality within most communities as the provisioners of day-to-day needs, there have also been moments of anti-Chinese violence in Jamaica, with the 1965 anti-Chinese riots standing out as the most notable example. Today, Jamaica is China's Anglophone Caribbean hub. The construction of Highway 2000 by the China Harbor Engineering Company, CHEC, represents an investment of over $700 million US. And in February 2017, the Export-Import Bank of China signed a $326 million US deal for the Southern Coastal Highway Improvement Project. China has also invested heavily in sugar and bauxite. The recent purchase of the Alpart Bauxite Alumina Refinery by Jiuquan Iron and Steel Company, JISCO, is expected to inject about $2 billion US into Jamaica's economy and to create 2,800 jobs for Jamaicans. This is, of course, pre-COVID. The JISCO refinery is also one of 3 pillars of China's contemporary drive to develop a logistics hub in Jamaica. And this is the drive that has preoccupied me over the past couple of years. What would it mean for a sovereign nation state to become a logistics hub within a global network of maritime trade with China at the center? And how does one bear witness to this kind of phenomenon? As I've been thinking about these questions, I've been paying attention to 3 sets of evidence, I suppose you could call it. The first is rumors and discourses that circulate regarding the Chinese presence. The second is the forms of activism that have developed in relation to Chinese initiatives. And the third is the visual and sonic evidence, or the lack thereof, of the large-scale development projects that have been announced. These kinds of evidence give a sense of the shared anxieties and uncertainties about what sovereignty will look like in an emerging world order, one in which the plantation is no longer central. They also provide insights into the extent to which the disciplinary power of the new epoch will resemble past forms of control and oppression, and the degree to which it will be legible. Earlier, I mentioned that in 2016, JISCO, Jiuquan Iron and Steel Company, which is a Chinese state-owned industrial group, purchased the Alpart Bauxite Alumina Refinery in the parish of St. Elizabeth. This is a bauxite mine and aluminum refinery that had previously been owned by Alcan and most recently by the Russian company UC Rusal, but it had gone into disuse. The purchase was somewhat of a surprise, however, coming as it did on the heels of a bid by the China Harbor Engineering Company to build a deepwater transshipment port and industrial park on one of the Goat Islands off the southeast coast of Kingston. The Goat Islands, surrounded by mangroves, I'm going to share some clips again. The Goat Islands are surrounded by mangroves, seagrass beds, and coral reefs, and they've been recognized as exceedingly important for biodiversity and have been buffers to the Kingston Harbor, which is the 7th largest natural harbor in the world, during extreme weather events. They have also long been of interest to foreign powers because of their strategic location as the first landmass encountered as one exits the north end of the Panama Canal. In 1941, the US obtained a 99-year lease for the Little Goat Island, along with the Vernon Field Air Base in southern Clarendon, among many other properties across the Caribbean, as part of the Destroyers for Bases agreement with the UK. But in 1999, the Jamaican government declared the islands and the surrounding seas, wetlands, dry limestone forests, and mangroves a protected area under 3 environmental laws that was to be managed by the Caribbean Coastal Area Management Foundation. In September 2013, the government of Jamaica announced a plan to develop the Goat Islands as a deep water transshipment hub with the Chinese government. And this launched an extended counter-campaign led by the Jamaica Environment Trust in collaboration with several international environmental organizations. After significant mobilizing with community members and extensive back and forth with government representatives, and in a twist that's likely familiar to all who have undertaken advocacy campaigns against one or another government agency or policy, Diana Macaulay, who was at the time directing Jamaica Environment Trust, came into possession of a document. It landed on her car, I was told, that outlined the results of a February 2013 report from an engineering firm that was contracted to assess 3 sites, including the Goat Islands, for this deep water port. In this report, the chief engineer actually argued for one of the other locations to be developed, not because of the environmental issues associated with the Goat Islands, but for, quote, shipping and engineering considerations that made it an unsuitable site. And it seems that this report was never made public, since the government continued to announce plans for the Goat Island through 2014 and 2015, and as late as 2016, despite that year's elections that resulted in a change of government and therefore potentially a renewed set of discussions about the terms of the agreement. During this time, the JET continued to petition for information from relevant ministers through the Access to Information Act, but they were denied due to the fact that disclosure or premature disclosure of information would or could have a substantial adverse effect on the Jamaican economy. That's their language. So it must have come as a complete surprise that 4 days after the Gleaner, which is the daily newspaper in Jamaica, reported that the Prime Minister was pushing ahead with plans to development a transshipment port and industrial and commercial zones in this environmentally protected area, that same newspaper reported that the government was scrapping the Goat Islands project. The JET's official position was that they were pleased with the result. Unofficially, however, they weren't sure their advocacy had anything to do with the Jamaican government's about-face, though it almost certainly had an effect on the Chinese company's decision to achieve their objectives in another location. So this bauxite refinery that was purchased by GISCO is now to be complemented by an industrial park and special economic zone costing more than $3 billion US. The Gansu Industrial Park, according to newspaper reports, is projected to create approximately 60,000 jobs and is one of 3 nodes of Jamaica's Logistics Hub initiative. Another such node is the proposed Aerotropolis in Clarendon. Minister of Parliament for Central Clarendon, Mike Henry, had been pushing for a multimodal logistics hub at the former US Air Base in Vernon Field since 2007. And finally, in April 2017, the Jamaican cabinet approved a development plan that would include the revival of Jamaica's railway system, as well as facilities for manufacturing and assembling, meetings and expositions, and cargo logistics and bulk port containers. The Vernon Field Aerotropolis would also include the retooling of a local high school toward aviation and shipping trades, the movement of the Jamaica Defense Force air wing training facilities, and the creation of over 600,000 jobs. Speaking with residents in April 2018 at a local community meeting, Mike Henry promised that the Aerotropolis would, quote, form part of the global Silk Route, which links the Mediterranean, the Red Sea with Southeast Asia and China. He continued, it will provide easy shipping access to the Panama Canal, the east coast of the Americas, the Mediterranean, and the west coast of Africa. In September 2018, Henry further explained the novelty of the Aerotropolis. He said, "The concept combines airport planning, urban planning, and business site planning to create a new sustainable urban form. It aims specifically to facilitate Jamaica becoming the 4th logistics hub in the world." And the other 3 are Rotterdam, Singapore, and Dubai. There's a breathlessness about the future orientation of this language, and yet concerns raised by residents at the April meeting also evoke prior imperial moments. Some of those living in Gimimibit, the town that abuts the airstrip, will have to be relocated to accommodate the construction and security requirements of the plan. 80 years earlier, these same residents would have been removed when the US originally built the runway and other facilities for the airbase. And indeed, colonial records for the period document the expenditures related to compensation to people whose lands were expropriated by the United States. Nevertheless, the first phase of the $2.5 billion development project, which was bushing the area around the runway, which after its decommissioning by the US in 1949 had been used as a drag racing venue, got underway in late 2018. Despite warnings from geographers within the earthquake unit that the location sits on alluvial deposits and is therefore not ideal for construction of an aerodrome, phase 2 of the development plan, attracting necessary private investments, was to have begun shortly thereafter, and the Aerotropolis was projected to be complete by mid-2019. However, what you just saw are images of how the airstrip looked in October 2019, and then again in January of this year. So you can see that it was to have been closed in September 2019, but we were driving it in mid-October. And then in January 2020, you could see the bushing and widening of the road that goes from the town nearest the sea to the fisherman's village on the beach. That had begun in October, and we saw the bulldozers, but much of that had been grown back by January. I'm pointing this out because the talk of belt and road can seem to permeate policy and popular discussion, and the future of Jamaica as a global logistics hub can appear as if it's just beyond the horizon. But even when plans seem to be underway, one can never be sure they'll fully materialize. People often chalk this up to a difference between Jamaica and China in terms of long-term planning. In Jamaica, many say, we plan in relation to election cycles, but in China, they're always looking at the long haul, 50 years down the line. This difference in scale will always disadvantage Western democracies as we have come to know them over the past 500 years. But it also alerts us to the possibilities that might inhere in the epochal shift to which I'm drawing our attention. If Western modernity was rooted in plantations, and if the dominant logics of the plantation, security, legibility, control, is always also potentially undone by that which it excludes, then a post-plantation imagination of sovereignty must be one that holds safety, illegibility, and the release of control at its core. As a way of concluding, I want to go back to our film work related to the 2020 Tivoli incursion. The longer documentary, 4 Days in May, features narratives that we recorded with residents of West Kingston after the incursion in 2010. Mothers describe watching their sons being executed. A brother mourns the killing of his sibling shot, quote, execution style, next to his stepfather. An aunt talks about having to identify her nephew's body, part of which had been burned beyond recognition. Other young men describe being taunted by soldiers, made to run while shots were being fired after them, being tied to other men and kept in a leaky bathroom overnight, not knowing whether they were going to live or die. Believing that Jamaicans are the primary audience for the longer version of this film, we have screened 4 Days in May in community-based settings in the parishes of Kingston, St. Thomas, and Portland, as well as at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. Given the intense political polarizations in Jamaican society, We have screened in spaces where people are already accustomed to coming together across political boundaries. These screenings have been followed by moderated community discussions during which people have talked about their own experiences of state violence, about the broader history of violence in Jamaica and the legacies of the Cold War and US intervention, and about the effects of the transnational trades in drugs and arms, also about the psychological trauma influencing their contemporary decision-making processes, and about the impossibility of measuring the long-term impact of states of emergency that result in significant civilian death. They've talked about the extent to which they feel transformation is possible. What's been notable about these discussions is that when confronted with the narratives of people who directly experience the violence of the state, narratives that detail both the quotidian and extraordinary ways violence has shaped their lives, audiences have sometimes reevaluated what they thought they understood about the events of May 2010. They've rethought their assumptions both about how political violence operates and about the humanity of people who live in areas where it's rampant. But during one post-discussion screening of our film in Kingston, a woman who had been a political representative for the People's National Party during the height of the political turf wars in the late 1970s spoke of being terrorized by the dawn of Tivoli Gardens during that period. She shook with rage as she asked, what has Tivoli learned from their experiences in 2010? This particular screening was on the campus of the University of the West Indies and was attended not only by students and faculty and by members of the Tivoli Gardens community, but also by many leaders of civil society organizations. When the woman asked, what has Tivoli learned from the incursion, she wasn't met with derision, even though her rage was palpable. She herself may not have been yet ready to do the work of accountability, but the Tivoli Gardens community residents who were also at the screening did not attempt to shout her down. Instead, the woman who had identified her nephew's burned body said, there are good and bad within Tivoli like everywhere else. One of the youth who had described his experiences in the film stood and sincerely thanked everyone for coming, especially all the uptown people, the middle class people, saying that he never would have thought so many people cared about what happened to him. And a longtime community activist responded gently to the woman. I think another way to ask that question, he said, is to wonder what Jamaica has learned from the incursion. Our film audience was reckoning with how to generate safety within a context of insecurity, with the cyclical quotidianity of forms of violence that comprise complex relations of scale, and with the ways their embodiments are marked by their geographies. If, as Mbembe has argued, quote, the colony represents the site where sovereignty consists fundamentally in the exercise of a power outside the law, end quote. And if Blackness, in its negation of law and juridical norms, unsettles this sovereignty, then we must cultivate a sovereignty that engulfs rather than one that defers and disavows. We must demand forms of accountability that nullify the normative relations that uphold coloniality and the space of the plantation as the ground of subjectivity and governance. Thank you.